Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're tuning us in. Welcome once again on 7-Eleven Day, July the 11th. It's usually free Slurpees today at 7-Eleven, so that's why I call it 7-Eleven Day. But you're listening to B&B Hockey Talk with your hosts, Aaron Bloxall and Matthew Balzer. Welcome once again as we continue to go through our 31 teams in 31 days. We're going to carry on with the Boston Bruins. And just before we get started, I'll turn it over to Matthew here, who's going to talk about a key signing today, and then he's going to jump right in to the forwards and projected lineups for the Boston Bruins. But thanks again for liking us. Hit the like button, smash that like button, and don't forget to share us, comment, leave us, your favorite Boston Bruin. I'm sure there's lots of Marchand lovers out there. And Matthew, over to you, my friend. How are you?
All right, doing good today. So the one signing today is Detroit signed Anthony Mantha to a 2-year deal worth $6.6 million. A good sign. I thought they'd have to pay him a little bit more for the season that he had. He had 24 goals, 48 points last year. Good young winger. The only thing to go along with that is that they only have just under $3 million in cap space left, and they still have to sign their top player, Dylan Larkin, to a new contract. So it'll be interesting to see how Detroit handles that situation. And jumping right into the Boston Bruins now here, starting with their forwards, probably one of the best lines in hockey.
Absolutely. Great line last year.
Yeah, Brad Marchand, Patrice Bergeron, and David Pastrnak as that number one line. Marchand, I'm a Canucks fan, so you'll know my opinion on him. It's frustrating to see such a great player, but also be such a pain in the ass. And you just look at some of the stuff he does, it's just like, oh my goodness, this makes you really angry. But
you don't like the fact that he's spreading love around out there by, giving the odd player a kiss?
I still can't believe that NHL didn't do anything about it. All they did was they gave him the warning. Don't do that. Don't do that.
Well, the chemistry between him and Bergeron is unbelievable. And we saw that with Team Canada because we know Bergeron's chemistry with Sidney Crosby's legendary since they were in junior before. And those two guys with a goal scorer like Pastrnak, just, to me, they were the best line in the playoffs, absolutely carried the Boston Bruins. But I'll let you continue with your thoughts and the other lines there.
But yeah, well, just to add on, I'm a huge David Pastrnak fan, though. As much as I don't like Boston, Pastrnak, he's just a small little winger, but man, is he a great player. And the Canucks took Jared McCann right before him in that draft too.
Which turned into Eric Goodbranson.
Yeah. All right. The second line I have as Jake DeBrusk, David Krejci, and Ryan Donato. DeBrusk had a great rookie season for Boston. And Ryan Donato, who should be up going for the Calder Trophy this year, joined the Bruins at the end of the year. Got into 12 games, had 5 goals, 9 points. And David Krejci, he's Mr. Consistent there, though he is injury prone. So it will be interesting to see how his health is for this coming year. Their third line, Langley native Danton Heinen, and at center David Backes, and yeah. And another young winger, Anders Bjork, who started off with them last year before he had a season-ending injury. 2 younger wingers, and then you have big David Backes in the middle. I put him in. I know you've been playing the wing a lot last year, but the loss of Riley Nash, I think will move him back into the middle. And Danton Heinen, another good rookie season last year for Boston. And it's always good to see some local guys around here doing well in the NHL. And then my fourth line, I have Joachim Nordstrom, who they signed over from Carolina. Sean Corrali at center, and Noel Achari, depending on how you pronounce it, as the fourth line. And with Chris Wagner, who they signed from the New York Islanders as the 13th forward. I think between those four guys, they'll bring the grit and they shown that they're able to chip in offensively here and there.
Like you're a big Pasternak fan that you are, I'm a huge Patrice Bergeron fan. He's a guy that gets it done at both ends of the rink. He's always in perfect positioning almost whenever he's on the ice, and he's a legend when it comes to faceoffs. So he's been one guy I've really, even though I haven't been a big Bruins fan, because I'm a Canucks fan, I've always respected and just absolutely loved Patrice Bergeron. So I really like what they're doing there. So let's get into the defense a little bit. As we know, they have the big 6'9" still back there, still kicking. He's now 41 years old, but Zdeno Chara, say that 10 times fast. I've got him with Charlie McAvoy. Then we got Torrey Krug with Brandon Carlo, Matt Grzelcyk. Sorry, Grzelcyk. We practiced this before we started too. It's a tough one. I mean, it's right up there with my last name, right? and of course, free agent signing John Moore, which I think was a really big signing for them, adding a lot of depth. They also have Kevin Miller and Dennis McQuaid. So they've actually got 8 pretty solid defensemen. I know McQuaid's fallen off the depth chart a little bit the last few years, but I know he's had a few injuries through those years as well. So if they can get some solid games out of him as a depth defenseman, it's looking pretty good. So I really like between the forwards and the defense what they've done so far, on how they're really implementing a lot of youth. While they still have these veterans like Marchand and Bergeron, they've really, they got a ton of young guys with Pasternak, DeBrusk, Danton Heinen, right, Donato, and then even on the back end with Krug and McAvoy. They've really, for a team that I know they missed the playoffs once after they won the Stanley Cup. They went to the finals again just shortly after that, but they've had a really successful time in the transition between, going from some of their older players to some of their youths. So I've been pretty impressed with that. And, of course, you mentioned Donato, potential Calder Trophy candidate. It's going to be a tough year for that. I know Canuck fans will want to see Elias Pettersson in the running for that, but with Rasmus Dahlin and so many more other great prospects, it's going to be interesting to see where that happens. So why don't you bring us home and talk about their goaltending?
Yeah, so they have Tuukka Rask as their number one. He had a great year last year again for Boston, 34 wins in 54 games. He's been Mr. Consistent for them back there since they've got him over from the Toronto Maple Leafs, who it's just another bad trade by the Leafs. And then they signed Yaroslav Halak over from the New York Islanders as their backup goalie since they lost Anton Khudobin to Dallas. I think that's big to have a guy like Halak, who I still think is a good goalie, but the defensive structure on the island was just brutal and didn't really give them him and Thomas Greiss much help back there. So I think they signed him to a 2-year deal, so that'll help Rask get some rest because he can play up to 30 games. And their third stringer, if there are any injuries, will be Zane McIntyre, who was a college goalie that they signed a few years back. And I think that with Boston losing Malcolm Subban last year on waivers, out-battled him for that third stringer spot last year. But he had a really good year down in the American League. He had 26 wins in 47 games and 7 shutouts. So
Wow.
so he'll be pushing for some playing time, I think, this year.
I think the Yaroslav Halak signing was really big. It really does get Tuukka Rask some rest. I think Halak still has a lot in the tank. And like you commented, he had a mess of a defense in front of him on the island last year. But I think Halak's still a good goalie, and he showed that in the World Cup of Hockey just a couple of falls ago when he was playing for, what was it, Team Europe. He, he really played well and helped lead them to the finals there against Canada. So let's touch on some of their UFAs that haven't signed yet, because I still think maybe one or two of these guys might come back, depending on what the team decides to do, and depending on what one of their players still decides to do. So do you want to touch on that, or do you want me to start?
You can start on Rick Nash there.
All right, yeah. So Rick Nash, obviously, he's the guy that's kind of told all the teams that he's on hold. He's trying to decide what to do, whether he's going to retire or wanting to re-sign. I know there's rumors that he might sign with Columbus, where it all began. But I really think Boston might be a fit still for him, depending on what he wants to get paid and where his, where they're willing to negotiate. So I think it's going to be a big decision what he does there. Some of the other players, Tommy Wingles, I think might be back. He still might. I still think he has a couple of years left in him. Brian Giunta, I don't see him coming back. He had a great Olympics last winter. Came in late into Boston. Got some playing time because of some injuries, but once the playoffs started, he was up in the press box. But I think he brought a lot of experience, especially for the younger players. I don't see him coming back. But and then, of course, defenseman Paul Poetsma. Again, with him, I don't see him coming back, but he still has a year or two left in the tank and a great depth defenseman for a team that's out there. Any you want to comment on any of that, or?
Yeah, well, with Rick Nash, it will be interesting. If Boston does want to bring him back, or if that does happen, they would have to move one of their defensemen, most likely McQuaid, just because they do have a lot of salary in those 8 defensemen that they have, and I think McQuaid would be the most likely that they would want to move to free up more cap space if Nash were to return. And the other guy, Tommy Wingles, that they did bring in, he did provide good depth on that fourth line, and he can still chip in offensively. So teams looking for a fourth line depth winger, I think he definitely end up somewhere before the start of the season.
And of course, they lost a handful of players to free agency. Why don't we start with you on those players there?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier, they lost Anton Khudobin to Dallas. Nick Holden, who they picked up from the Rangers last year, he signed with the Vegas Golden Knights. Riley Nash, who I think might be one of the biggest losses, I think, that they had this offseason. He signed a 3-year deal with Columbus, and he really stepped up when Bergeron was out with injuries this year to fill in on that top line with Marchand and Pastrnak. Tim Schaller, who signed with the Canucks, he was a really good player on their fourth line all year. And one guy who played, who was a point a game down in their farm system, Austin Czarnik, signed a 2-year deal with Calgary. It'll be interesting to see if he does end up getting a shot there in their top 12 this year with Calgary.
Yeah, I think Riley Nash will be a huge loss for them, just because he could play left side, right side, or down the middle. They had him up and down the lineup in the top 3 lines throughout the year, and he fit in basically on every line that he played in. Very reliable defensive and can chip in offensively. So a bit of a hole there for sure to fill. They don't have a lot of prospects. We were a little surprised about that, or at least I was. But I do know, like, this year they didn't have a lot of draft picks because they really went for it last year in bringing in some of those veterans trying to go for it in the playoffs. But I've got a handful that I wanted to talk about, and I know you've got a couple that were on your list as well. So let's jump into there. Let's jump into those ones. So for me, I've got we talked about Ryan Donato already in how he's a potential for Calder candidate. They've got a guy down in their farm system that played for the University of Wisconsin last year, Trent Frederick. He got called up after they were out of the playoffs. He ended up signing with the Providence Bruins. He played just a handful of games for them and getting 8 points, so that was pretty big. He was a first-round draft pick of theirs in 2016. Zach Senyshyn, a good Canadian guy. By the way, going through their roster, I really noticed that the majority of their team is American. I was really surprised about that. To see a team with so many American-born players, a few Europeans and very few Canadians on their roster. Obviously, there's only about 3 or 4 Canadians, if I'm not mistaken, on their entire roster, and of course, 2 of them are their top 2 players in Marchand and Bergeron. But Zach Senyshyn, first-round draft pick in 2015, good Canadian kid out of Ottawa, had a decent year for them in Providence. He's probably going to start there again, but he's working on making his way up. Jakob Forsbalka Carlson, another guy that had 58 games down the farm and ended up getting 32 points. He was a second-round pick in 2015. And, of course, their prize possession from last year, Urho Vakanainen out of the Finnish league. I know he's been compared a lot to Olli Juolevi, who the Canucks have, and he's making his way. I don't know if he's going to stay in the Finnish league or not this year, or if he's coming to play in Providence. He is under contract, though, so I can see him playing in Providence. And then, of course, their 2015 one of the 3 first-rounders that they had in a row. DeBrusk, I know, was one of them. But they had Jacob Zboril, another defenseman that had a good season in Providence last year. I shake my head, though, when I see this draft pick, only because they took him instead of Matthew Barzal or Brock Besser. And that draft, man, can you imagine if Boston – with those 3 picks, decided to take DeBrusk, Barzal, and Besser as those 3 picks? I can't imagine what their team would look like if they had a magic draft that year. But they could have. They had the picks, but unfortunately they didn't take those guys. But Zboril has some big shoes to fill coming along, but I still think he's at least a year or 2 away from the NHL. So what do you think of the prospects, those ones that I just mentioned? And, of course, I know you've got a couple other ones that you want to touch on.
Yeah, so Trent Frederick is the biggest name there, I'd say. If there was a prospect that could make the jump to the NHL this year, along with Ryan Donato, I think it would be Frederick, especially with the center ice position. If you want to move back as over to the wing and put Frederick there, I could see that as an option with college players mostly being more mature and NHL ready. Since they play more years down in the minors there. The other big name, I brought up Zane McIntyre earlier. That would be their big goalie prospect again. One guy, I'm not sure if he will return to the NHL in years to come, but Alexander Koklachev, he's been a point-a-game guy. He had 52 points last year in the K. Or 50 points in 52 games in the KHL last year. Center iceman. If he does end up returning in a few years when his contract's up, that would be a name I'd want to look out for. Another guy, Peter Sellerik. He had 23 points in 35 games down in Providence this year. He has had a couple looks up in the NHL. I believe he's a bigger winger that I'd look out for if they need call-ups. But once again, Donato and Frederick, I think, are the 2 big names to look out for this year.
Overall, the Boston Bruins finished with 112 points last year, only 1 back of division winners Tampa Bay Lightning. I personally see them digressing a little bit, probably to about 100 to 105 points. Where do you see them finishing this year?
Yeah, I still think they will be in the top 3 in that division, like Tampa being number 1, and I put probably Toronto as number 2. I would see them in that 3rd spot in their division, and then potentially would be another Toronto, Boston.
That's what I was just thinking.
Yeah, but yeah, I think a big thing it'll come down to is their younger forwards. If they're able to continue to progress like Jake DeBrusk and Danton Heinen, who had good years last year, you don't want them to get into the sophomore slump
Mhm.
that some players do. And yeah, and then a lot is riding on Ryan Donato and Anders Bjork, guys like that, to make big steps. But even then, their goaltending and defense is really good. But as long as that big line of Marchand, Bergeron, and Pastrnak keep clicking the way they are, I'd see them being a top three team in the Atlantic this year.
I absolutely can't wait to see if there will be another Toronto-Boston first-round matchup next year. I just know there's a lot of history there, and going to 7 last year, with Toronto getting definitely improving this year, it'll be really good to see what happens. But anyways, leave a comment below who your favorite Boston Bruin player is. Remember to smash that like button. Share this feed with your friends. I want to thank all the watchers, all the listeners out there. We've had a couple of our videos go basically that are trending in British Columbia. Facebook's been notifying us that our videos are taking off. So thank you to you, the listener, to you, the watcher, for giving us all that love. Again, happy 7-Eleven Day, everybody. Go get your free Slurpee before they're out. Again, this is B&B Hockey Talk, and I'm Aaron Bloxel with Matthew Balzer. I always almost want to call him Barzell, but I know I've seen him skate, not quite as fast, but he's definitely a better goalie. Anyways, B&B Hockey Talk, thanks again for joining us. Have a fantastic day, and we'll see you all tomorrow.